In 2024, a construction crew in rural Texas dug up something that had been buried 8 feet underground for 30 years. 5 bodies. 4 of them were children. And the people responsible had been living in the same town the entire time. In the summer of 1994, 4 children vanished from their family's ranch outside Cutters Creek, Texas, during a 4th of July weekend. No ransom, no bodies, no answers. For 30 years, the town stayed quiet. The kind of quiet that has reasons. When a Texas Ranger named Daniel Harper started asking questions, he discovered that the truth had never left Cutters Creek. It had just learned how to smile at the right people. The summer heat in Cutters Creek, Texas, pressed down on everything like a thumb on a bruise. It was the kind of heat that didn't just sit in the air, but soaked into the wood of old buildings, into the cracked asphalt of 2-lane roads, into the leather seats of pickup trucks left too long in the sun. The kind of heat that made people slow and quiet and mean in ways they didn't fully understand. Delia Parsons had lived in Cutters Creek her whole life, 62 years of it, and she said the same thing every August. The town didn't cool down until God decided it had suffered enough. Most years, that happened sometime in October. The excavator operator's name was Roy Sutherland, and he was not a man given to dramatics. He'd been running heavy equipment for 23 years across the Texas Panhandle, and had dug up plenty of things he hadn't expected to find. Old fence posts, rusted farm equipment, once an entire car buried nose down in a dry creek bed outside Sweetwater. He'd seen enough to know that the ground in this part of the state held its secrets the way old men held grudges, tight and quiet and permanent. He was clearing the foundation of the old Cartwright Ranch property on the eastern edge of Cutters Creek, a place that had been empty for 11 years and was finally being converted into a commercial grain storage facility. The morning had been ordinary: coffee from the diner on Route 7, a brief argument with his foreman about the placement of a drainage line, the steady diesel groan of the machine eating into dry Texas earth. He was 4 feet down when the bucket caught on something, and the resistance was wrong. Roy killed the engine and climbed down. The sun was fully up by then, already past reasonable and heading toward brutal, and the dry air tasted of dust and old grass. He crouched at the edge of the trench and looked at what his bucket had disturbed, and for a long moment he stayed very still, because some part of his brain processed the information before the rest of him was ready to accept it. He pulled out his phone and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, he said, "I need you to send somebody out to the old Cartwright place on County Road 18. Tell them to bring the medical examiner." Then he climbed back up onto the running board of his excavator and sat in the shade of the cab and didn't touch anything else for the rest of the morning. He was still sitting there when the first sheriff's deputy arrived 40 minutes later. The bones were small. That was the detail that made Deputy Cassie Holt stop breathing for a moment when she stepped down into the trench. Not the fact of them, not the age she could already estimate from the brittleness and the color, the deep ivory of remains that had been in the ground a very long time. The size of them, the delicate architecture of a child's rib cage, partially collapsed, the long bones of the legs no longer than her forearm. She called the Callahan County Sheriff's Office, and then the Texas Rangers, and then stood at the edge of the trench in the white August heat, and did not say anything to Roy Sutherland for a long time. By early afternoon, there were 7 vehicles on the property, and a forensic team from Abilene working the site in the careful, methodical way that all truly terrible discoveries demand. The lead forensic anthropologist, a quiet woman named Dr. Suzanne Reeves, spent 2 hours in the trench before she climbed out, pulled off her latex gloves, and spoke to the 2 men waiting near the crime scene tape. Multiple individuals, she said. At least 4, possibly 5. Juvenile remains in all cases. Time and ground is significant. I'd estimate between 25 and 35 years. She paused. They were placed here intentionally. The positioning is deliberate. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a natural burial. Texas Ranger Daniil Harper had driven from his office in Abilene in 40 minutes, pushing his truck through the flat, open country with the windows down because the air conditioning had been broken for 2 weeks, and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it. He was 48 years old, lean and angular in the way of men who forget to eat when they're working, with gray beginning at his temples and deep-set eyes that had seen enough to stay permanently careful. He listened to Dr. Reeves without interrupting, which was his habit. Then he looked out at the trench, at the crime scene tape snapping in the hot wind, at the dry yellow fields stretching away in every direction toward a horizon that offered nothing. "When will you have preliminary identifications?" he asked. 48 hours for dental comparison if we have records to match against. DNA will take longer. Dr. Reeves looked at him with the level expression of someone who has spent a career delivering bad news. "Ranger Harper, I think you're going to want to pull your cold case files tonight. Whatever happened here didn't happen recently." Harper already knew which case this was. He'd known the moment Cassie Holt described the trench on the phone. Known from the location and the county and the approximate age range of the remains. He'd grown up 40 miles from Cutter's Creek. He'd been 20 years old in the summer when 4 children disappeared from the Cartwright property during a family gathering. And he remembered the faces on the missing posters. Remembered the way the whole region had talked about it for years. Remembered the way it had eventually grown quiet, in the way that unresolved things go quiet, sinking down into the sediment of local memory. He drove back to Abilene. He pulled the files. He read them through until 3 in the morning in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold, untouched, on the table beside him. The Cartwright disappearances. Summer of 1994. 4 children, all between the ages of 8 and 14, vanished during a 4th of July weekend gathering at the family ranch outside Cutter's Creek. Maya Cartwright, 14. Eli Cartwright, 12. Both belonged to David and Susan Cartwright, who owned the ranch. Their cousins, Lily Soto, 10, and James Soto, 8, had come with their mother, Megan Carter, who was Susan Cartwright's younger sister. The adults had been in the main house. The children had been given permission to sleep outside in the old bunkhouse, 100 yards from the main structure, something they'd done on previous visits. In the morning, all 4 beds were empty. The bunkhouse door stood open. The children were gone. The investigation had lasted 8 months in any serious form, and considerably longer in its slow, diminishing tale. The prevailing theory had been abduction by an unknown individual, someone who had known the property or had been watching the family. The ranch was isolated, bordered on 3 sides by the open country of the Texas plains, with access via a single, unpaved road. No witnesses. No physical evidence linking any suspect. No bodies ever found. Until now. Harper read the interview transcripts of the adults present that night. David Cartwright. Susan Cartwright, later deceased, cancer, in 2011. Megan Carter, née Cartwright, 31 years old at the time of the disappearance. A neighbor, Frank Dunn, who had stopped by earlier in the evening. And 2 names Harper underlined with a pen, and then sat looking at for a long time. Walter Briggs, who had been in attendance at the gathering as a family friend, and was by 1994 already serving his first term as mayor of Cutter's Creek. And Dr. Alan Pierce, a psychologist with a private practice in town, who had been treating Susan Cartwright for anxiety and had attended the gathering at her invitation. Harper set down his pen. Outside, the Texas night was black and open, the stars very bright and very cold, the kind of sky that makes you feel the distance between where you are and everything else. A coyote called from somewhere across the highway, a sound like a question asked into darkness. He picked up his phone and found a contact number for Megan Carter. It was listed in the files as a California address, updated as recently as 8 years ago in a follow-up call from the original detective, now retired. The number was probably wrong. He tried it anyway. It rang 4 times, and then a woman's voice answered, rough with interrupted sleep. "Who is this?" "Miss Carter, my name is Daniel Harper. I'm a Texas Ranger with the Major Crimes Division out of Abilene. I'm sorry to be calling at this hour." He paused. "We found them." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that he thought she might have disconnected. Then he heard her breathing change, something tight and controlled breaking loose in it, and she said, "Where?" "On the property, the Cartwright Ranch. We believe they've been there the whole time." Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet, the way voices get when a person is trying to contain something enormous. "I'll drive," she said. "I'm in Odessa. I'll be there by morning." Harper set down the phone. He looked at the files spread across his kitchen table, at the photographs of 4 children clipped to the intake reports. 4 school portrait smiles frozen in 1994. He pressed his thumb against the corner of one photograph, Maya Cartwright's, and held it there for a moment. And then he stood up and went to the window and watched the dark Texas highway stretch away into nothing. And somewhere out there, a truck with one working taillight moved through the night and disappeared around a long curve, and the road was empty again. He had a feeling, the kind that came from 20 years of working cases in the flat, hard country of West Texas, that whoever had put those children in the ground was someone the family had trusted, someone who had eaten at their table, someone who had smiled at those children. He turned from the window. On the kitchen counter, half hidden under a stack of old mail he hadn't dealt with, was a child's drawing, faded and soft at the creases from years of folding and unfolding. His daughter had made it when she was 7, 3 years before the accident on the 277 outside San Angelo. He didn't move the mail. He went back to the table and kept reading. Megan Carter arrived at the Cartwright property at 6:40 in the morning, pulling a dusty silver sedan off County Road 18 onto the gravel margin where the crime scene tape began. Harper was already there, standing beside his truck with a paper cup of gas station coffee, watching the forensic team resume work in the pale, early light. He'd slept 2 hours in the truck cab, which was 2 more than he'd expected. She was 42 years old, and she looked like someone who had spent years making sure she appeared composed. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that might have been beautiful before something heavy had settled into it permanently. She wore jeans and a plain gray shirt, and she walked toward the crime scene tape without hesitating, her eyes moving to the trench, and then she stopped about 10 feet short of it and stood very still. Harper walked to her. "Miss Carter? They're still down there?" she asked. "Dr. Reeves and her team are documenting everything in place before the remains are transported. It'll be another day, maybe 2. He stopped beside her, close enough to speak quietly. "You didn't have to come out to the site. We could have met at the barracks in Abilene. I needed to see it." She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the trench. "I've been imagining this place for 30 years, what it would look like if they found them. I needed it to be real." They stood for a moment in the growing heat. A scissor-tailed flycatcher landed on the crime scene tape and regarded them and then lifted away into the white sky. "How much do you know about the original investigation?" he asked. "Everything they would tell the family." A brief pause. "And some things they wouldn't." He asked her to come to the Cutters Creek Sheriff's substation, a low cinder-block building on the edge of town that smelled of old coffee and window unit air conditioning. He put her in a small interview room with a clean cup of coffee and a box of tissue he left at the far end of the table, close enough to be available and far enough not to be presumptuous. He'd learned that from a detective in El Paso years ago, and he'd never forgotten it. She talked for 2 hours. She'd been 31 that summer, recently divorced, working as a legal assistant in Odessa. She had driven to the Cartwright Ranch on Thursday, July 3rd, with Lily and James, her 2 kids, planning to stay through the weekend. Her sister Susan and David had been preparing for a party on the 4th, a gathering of close family friends. By Friday evening, there were 8 adults at the ranch and 4 children. Walter Briggs was there, she said. The way she said his name told Harper something. Not accusatory, not careful, just weighted. He'd been friends with David for years. They went to school together. Walter was already on the town council by then, heading into his first mayor's campaign. She looked at her coffee. He brought wine. I remember that specifically because it was good wine, not the kind of thing you usually saw at a ranch 4th of July. He seemed very pleased about something that weekend, happy in a way that was almost too much. And Dr. Pierce? A small shift in her expression. Susan had been seeing him for about 18 months. Anxiety and depression. She'd had a difficult couple of years. Megan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He came at her invitation. She trusted him completely. Said he'd helped her more than any doctor she'd ever seen. She looked up at Harper. "I didn't like him." "Why not?" "Gut feeling. He paid too much attention to the children. Not in an obvious way, nothing you could point to. He asked them questions about school, about their friends, remembered things they'd said at previous visits. Susan thought it was wonderful, that he was interested in the whole family dynamic." Megan's jaw tightened slightly. "I thought he was gathering information." Harper made a note, but didn't respond to it yet. "Walk me through the evening of July 4th. She did. The gathering, the food, the fireworks that David had driven 2 counties over to purchase. The children eating on the porch and then drifting toward the bunkhouse as the adults settled in with drinks and the long, slow conversations of a summer night. Susan checking on the children at 11, finding them settled and half asleep. Megan going to bed around midnight in the main house guest room. The silence that followed. "David came to wake me at 5:30 in the morning," she said. Her voice flattened as she approached it, the way voices flatten over a story that has been told too many times. "He said he'd gone to call the kids for chores and the bunkhouse was empty. I thought maybe they'd gotten up early and gone to the pond. We used to let them do that." She stopped. But the screen door was open, and James's shoes were by his cot. He never went anywhere without his shoes. He was 8 years old, and he already had that habit. I don't know where he got it from. She pressed her lips together. "That's when I knew." Harper let the silence sit for a moment before asking the next question. That was also something he'd learned in 20 years. That silence after something important was not emptiness. It was the space where details that needed to be said found their way to the surface. "Miss Carter," he said, "in the original investigation, there were follow-up interviews conducted 6 months after the disappearance. You gave 2 statements. In the second one, you mentioned that in the days before the gathering, your sister had mentioned a concern she had about someone in the town. The original detective noted it, but didn't pursue it in depth. Do you remember what she told you?" Megan Carter looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something. "Susan called me 3 weeks before the 4th, she said. She was upset. She'd overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear. She'd gone to Dr. Pierce's office for an appointment and arrived 10 minutes early, and his door was slightly open, and she heard him on the phone." Megan set down her coffee cup. She said he was talking about money, a large amount of money, and she heard him say the mayor's name, Walter's name, and then he said, "It's buried deep enough that no one will ever find it," and laughed. Harper kept his face still. What did she make of it? She thought maybe it was an investment of some kind, a business arrangement. She told herself there was an innocent explanation, but she was shaken. Megan met his eyes. "She told me she thought about asking Alan about it and then decided not to. She was afraid of what his answer might be." Harper drove back to the ranch site after the interview and stood at the edge of the trench for a long time. The forensic team worked around him with the careful patience of people who understood that the dead had been waiting this long and could wait a little longer for accuracy. Dr. Reeves climbed up from the trench at one point and stood beside him. "Preliminary trauma assessment," she said quietly. 3 of the 4 individuals show evidence of blunt force injury to the skull. The 4th, the smallest one, shows a fracture pattern consistent with the same mechanism. She paused. Whoever did this was efficient and methodical. This wasn't panic. This was planning. Harper nodded. He looked at the flat Texas landscape around the ranch, the dry grass, the long shadows of the afternoon sun, the old bunkhouse sitting 100 yards away with its door standing open because someone had left it open, and there was no one left who cared to close it. Inside the bunkhouse, on the floor beside the cot nearest the window, someone on the original investigation team had left a small chalk mark 30 years ago, noting the position of a child's shoe. The chalk mark was still there, faded but readable. 8 years old. He walked to his truck and sat in the heat with the door open and called the Cutters Creek Municipal Office and asked for the current whereabouts of former Mayor Walter Briggs. The woman on the phone told him that Walter Briggs had passed away in 2019 of a heart attack and was buried in Cutters Creek Municipal Cemetery. She sounded proud of this, the way small-town administrative staff sometimes sound proud of the history they're custodians of, unaware of what that history contains. He sat with that for a moment. Then he called the Oregon State Department of Professional Licensing and asked about a Dr. Alan Pierce, formerly of Cutters Creek, Texas, licensed psychologist. After 4 transfers and 12 minutes on hold, a clerk told him that Dr. Alan Pierce had held an active license in Oregon until 2021, when he'd voluntarily retired. A last known address in a small coastal town called Port Orford was on file. Harper started the truck. On the back seat, he'd left the original case file, and a page had slipped out during the drive from Abilene and now lay face up on the upholstery. And the face of James Soto, 8 years old, smiled at him from a school portrait that was 30 years out of date. He reached back and turned the photograph face down, and then he pulled out of the ranch and onto the county road and drove back toward town, and the dust rose behind him and hung in the still air for a long time before it settled. He found David Carter's journal on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the investigation. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been executing a standard property search of the main ranch house under a warrant obtained from the Callahan County District Court, moving through rooms that smelled of abandonment and old heat, photographing everything before he touched it. The ranch had been bank-owned since 2013, when David Cartwright's finances had collapsed in a sequence that Harper had found interesting when he pulled the financial records, but hadn't yet fully explained. The furniture was draped in plastic sheeting. The windows were filmed with dust. The house had the feeling of a place that had been deliberately emptied of something essential. He found it in the back of a closet, in the room David had used as a home office, inside a metal lockbox that had been placed behind a false panel in the closet wall. The panel was well made, flush with the surrounding drywall, painted the same color. He'd found it by noticing that the closet was 6 inches shallower than the corresponding space on the exterior wall. The lockbox required a key. He sent for a locksmith, waited 20 minutes in the heat, and had it open before noon. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, a man's handwriting, small and slightly forward-tilting, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly and often, with a practiced pressure of urgency. He read it in his truck, with the engine running for the air conditioning. The first entry was dated August 1994, 5 weeks after the children disappeared. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Susan is barely functional, and I'm holding everything together with my hands shaking. The police ask the same questions. They look at me like they're waiting for me to break down and confess to something I don't know. I want to tell them everything, but I don't know what everything is. I don't know what I'm not supposed to say. Harper turned pages. September 1994. Walter came to the house today, not in any official capacity, he made that clear. He sat in the kitchen and had coffee, and talked about the investigation, and how difficult it must be for the family. He looked at me across the table and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said, "The most important thing right now is that everyone stays calm and remembers what they know and what they don't." He said it twice, what they know and what they don't. Then he drove away in his white F250, and I sat in the kitchen for an hour afterward and didn't move. Harper's jaw tightened. October 1994. Alan called me from his office. He wanted to know how Susan was managing. I told him she was destroyed. He said he was concerned about her stability, about what she might say in a state of emotional distress, that grief sometimes caused people to misremember things and conflate them, and that it could cause real harm to innocent people. He said he wanted to schedule time with her to help her through the process of sorting her memories. I told him she wasn't seeing anyone right now. He said he understood and that the offer stood. After I hung up, I went outside and stood in the field and thought about what he was actually telling me. He knew. He knew, and he was afraid of what Susan might say. I think Alan Pierce killed my children. I think Walter Briggs knows why. And I think if I say that to anyone, I am going to disappear the same way they did. Harper set the journal on the passenger seat and called Megan Carter. She answered on the second ring. He'd given her his direct number 3 days into the investigation, and they'd talked every day since, sometimes briefly and sometimes for much longer, late in the evening, when the day's work had reached its limit, and the dark, open Texas sky outside both their windows provided something like privacy. "I found something," he said. "I need you to come to the ranch." She was there in 40 minutes. She read the journal in the truck beside him, her shoulder close enough that he could feel the heat of her arm, both of them sitting in the running engine's cold air, while outside the sun turned everything white and relentless. He watched her face as she read. She was very controlled, this woman. She'd had 30 years of practice at controlling what her face did when something was terrible. When she finished, she set the journal on her knees and looked out through the windshield at the old house. "He knew," she said. "All those years. He knew." The question is exactly how much he knew and when. Does it matter? Her voice wasn't harsh, just tired. The kind of tired that has become a permanent condition. It matters for the legal framework. But you're right that it doesn't change the core fact. Harper looked at the journal. Your brother-in-law was afraid for his life. That's the only reading of these entries that holds up. He found out or figured out that Pierce and Briggs were responsible, and instead of going to police, he went silent. And Susan never knew. I don't think so. The entries don't suggest he told her. I think he was trying to protect her. Harper paused. Or himself. She turned to look at him then, and he held her gaze because she needed someone to hold it. And there was something in the quality of the silence between them that he recognized from specific moments in his work. Moments when two people who are moving through the same darkness arrive at the same point at the same time, and find that proximity is the only honest response. What do you do now? She asked. I go to Oregon. She nodded slowly. And David? I bring him in for a formal interview. The journal is enough for that. He looked out at the ranch. I want you to be careful, Megan. You've been asking questions around town. People know you're here. People know what this investigation is pointing toward. People in this town have known something for 30 years, she said. They chose not to see it. That's my point. He met her eyes. The ones who chose not to see it have reasons to keep not seeing it. Don't underestimate what people will do to protect a version of events they've lived inside for 3 decades. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached past him and picked up the journal from the seat, her hand brushing his wrist. And she read the last entry he'd shown her one more time, silently. And when she set it back down, her hand stayed on the seat close to his for just a moment before she pulled it back. That night, driving back to Abilene on Route 277 in the dark, Harper passed a truck parked on the margin of the road with its lights off. He noted the make and model in the automatic way of 20 years of watching everything. White Ford F250, no plates. As he passed, he glanced in the rearview mirror, and the truck's engine started and its lights stayed off as it pulled back onto the road behind him. He drove for 6 miles, watching it in the mirror. Then it turned off onto a county road, and its taillights disappeared. He drove the rest of the way to Abilene with both hands on the wheel and the back of his neck tight with something he didn't yet have a word for. When he got home, his front door was unlocked. He was certain he had locked it that morning. He cleared the house methodically, room by room, with his weapon drawn and the lights off, moving by the familiarity of the layout. It took 6 minutes. The house was empty. Nothing appeared disturbed. But on the kitchen table, where he'd left the Cartwright case files that morning, one photograph had been moved. Maya Cartwright's school portrait, which he'd placed inside the file folder, was now face up on the table, separate from everything else. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he got his phone and called the Abilene locksmith's emergency line and had his locks changed at 1 a.m, and he sat at the kitchen table until dawn with his back to the wall and the files in front of him. And when the sky outside began to shift from black to gray, he called the Rangers district office and requested a welfare check on Megan Carter in Odessa. She was fine. She called him back 20 minutes later, confused and then not confused when he told her about the door, and her voice shifted into something careful and alert in the way of a person who has lived with wariness for a long time and knows exactly how to access it. "They're watching you," she said. "That's the reasonable conclusion. Then they know how close you are." "Good," he said. That's what I want them to know. He booked a flight to Portland, Oregon for the following morning and drove to Cutter's Creek one more time before leaving. He needed to speak to David Cartwright. David was living in a rental house on the west side of Cutter's Creek, a small stucco structure behind a chain-link fence with a dead lawn. He was 61 years old now, a lean and diminished man who moved carefully, the way men move when they've learned that sudden actions have consequences. He opened the door before Harper knocked, which meant he'd been watching the road, and he stepped back and let Harper in without speaking. The interior of the house was scrupulously clean and nearly empty of personal objects. No photographs, no decoration. The furniture of a man who expected at any moment to have to leave. Harper sat at the kitchen table. David sat across from him with his hands folded, and Harper set the lockbox and the journal on the table between them. David looked at it for a long time. "Where did you find that?" "Behind the false wall in your office at the ranch." A silence. Outside, a mourning dove called from somewhere close. 3 descending notes repeated. "I've been expecting this for 11 years, David said, "since I sold the ranch. I thought about going back to get it, but I was afraid to." He looked at the journal. "I was afraid someone would see me." "Who?" David met his eyes for the first time. "Walter Briggs had people in this town who were loyal to him, the way you're loyal to someone who's given you things and taken things from you, and made sure you understand that the arrangement is permanent. He's dead now, but that doesn't mean those people stopped." He paused. "I've been watching my back for 30 years, Ranger Harper. Tell me what you know." He talked for 2 hours. Harper let him talk without interrupting, which was the only way this kind of testimony came out whole. David had understood, before the gathering that summer, that something was wrong between Briggs and Pierce. He'd overheard a conversation in the weeks before the 4th, fragments of it through an open window at the ranch, while Briggs and Pierce walked in the yard. Something about money and accounts, and an arrangement that needed to stay quiet. He hadn't understood it fully. He'd filed it away with the vague discomfort that polite people file things that don't quite fit. And then the children were gone. And in the weeks that followed, as the investigation moved through its stages, Walter Briggs had made it clear to David in a series of quiet, unremarkable conversations that had nothing overtly threatening about them, that David should focus on his grief, on supporting Susan, on moving forward, and should trust the process of the investigation and not confuse things by volunteering half-understood fragments of overheard conversation to detectives who were already overwhelmed. "He never threatened me directly," David said. "That's the part that's hard to explain. He never said a single thing that could be called a threat. But I understood perfectly that if I pushed on what I knew, my life was going to get very difficult. And Susan was barely alive. I didn't have anything left to fight with." "You destroyed evidence," Harper said. The journal entry about a phone call David had made to Pierce in early 1995 had been explicit about that. A tape recording Susan had made of a conversation with Pierce in which Pierce had said something ambiguous but suggestive about the children and the night they disappeared. David nodded without flinching. "I burned it. I am not going to tell you I'm proud of that." "What was on it?" "Pierce talking to Susan about her memories, trying to guide her, manage what she remembered. At one point she asked him if he thought the children had suffered, and he said, 'They wouldn't have known anything was happening. It would have been very quick.'" David's hands tightened slightly. "Susan didn't hear it the way I did. She found it comforting. I heard a man who knew exactly how 4 children had died." Harper looked at him across the table. "You could have saved other children. Pierce and Briggs were never held accountable. They had 30 years of freedom." "I know." David held his gaze, and his face carried something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but some compound of both that had no name and required no response. I know. Harper's flight left Abilene Regional at 6 the next morning. In the airport, moving through the thin, early light of the terminal, his phone rang. It was Dr. Reeves. DNA confirmation came back, she said. We have positive matches on all 4 individuals. Maya and Eli Cartwright, Lily and James Soto. A pause. And Ranger Harper, there's something else. He stopped walking. There's a 5th set of remains, partially commingled with the others. It was missed in the initial assessment. Adult female, age estimation between 25 and 35 at time of death. Time in ground consistent with the others. He stood in the middle of the terminal while people moved around him, a stream parting around a stone. Can you run DNA against Susan Cartwright? He asked quietly. Susan, who had died of cancer in 2011, whose death had been documented, whose family had held a funeral and buried her in the Cutters Creek Cemetery. I'll need a comparative sample, Dr. Reeves said, but yes. Another pause. Ranger, if this is who I think it might be, then the cancer and the death and the burial— I know, he said. I know what it means. He stood there for a moment longer, and then he moved toward his gate, and the terminal hummed around him with the ordinary noise of people going places. And he thought about a woman who had trusted a doctor and a mayor and the structures of a small town to hold her safe. And he thought about what it meant when all of those structures were the threat. Port Orford, Oregon, sat on a rocky headland above the Pacific, a small, working harbor town that smelled of salt and diesel and the cold, wet air coming off the water. It was nothing like Texas. Everything was gray and green and damp, the sky pressing low over the ocean, the light diffuse and soft in a way that felt foreign after the hard, white sun of the Panhandle. Dr. Alan Pierce lived in a house set back from the bluff road, a weathered structure with a small garden that was surprisingly well tended, roses and Pacific Coast lavender in careful borders. He was 71 years old, heavier than his file photographs, with thick white hair and the kind of open, practiced face that Harper recognized immediately, the face of someone trained to appear trustworthy. He opened the door before Harper could knock. He'd seen him coming up the walk. I assume you're the ranger who called yesterday, Pierce said. I am. You'd better come in. The interior of the house was lined with books and comfortable furniture, the home of a man who had arranged a pleasant retirement and was determined to enjoy it. Harper sat in an armchair by a window that looked toward the ocean. Pierce sat across from him. 2 Oregon State Police detectives stood near the door, present by arrangement, quiet for now. Harper laid the case file on the coffee table. Then he laid the journal beside it. Then he laid the financial records he'd obtained from the state of Texas, documents tracing money from a set of accounts held under a corporate name that had taken his forensic accountant 9 days to trace back to Walter Briggs. Pierce looked at the documents without touching them. His expression moved through several things, none of them the shock of a man confronted with fabricated accusations. The embezzlement, Harper said. Briggs and you. He was running money out of the Cutters Creek Municipal Development Fund. You were running it through fake patient accounts at your practice and into clean accounts. You'd been doing it for at least 4 years before the summer of 1994. Pierce was quiet. Susan Cartwright arrived early to an appointment, Harper continued. She overheard enough to understand that something was wrong. She mentioned it to her sister, Megan Carter. Did she mention it to you directly? A pause. She asked me about it. What did she say? She said she'd overheard me on the phone and was confused about something and wondered if everything was all right. He folded his hands. It was the way she said it. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't accusatory. She was trying to give me the benefit of the doubt. That made it worse, actually. He looked down at his hands. It meant she trusted me. And you told Walter Briggs. Yes. And you planned the gathering. Pierce shook his head slightly. I didn't plan anything. Walter planned it. I told him what Susan had overheard, and he said we needed to handle it before it went any further. And by handle it, I understood what he meant. I told myself I didn't, but I understood. He looked up at Harper, and his eyes had gone flat and old. He asked me about the ranch layout. I'd been there for visits. I told him about the bunkhouse. The children. The children weren't supposed to be involved. Pierce's voice was very steady, the steadiness of something that had been rehearsed many times in the interior of a long, private reckoning. Walter said he was going to frighten Susan, make her understand that she needed to stay quiet. I didn't know about the children until afterward. He paused. They saw him, coming across the yard toward the bunkhouse. Eli recognized him. That's what Walter told me. He'd been left with no choice. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Pacific moved against the headland with a slow, continuous sound. Lily Soto was 8 years old, Harper said. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. I know. And Susan Cartwright. A longer silence. Walter told me she'd been located and dealt with 2 weeks after the investigation began. I believed, or I allowed myself to believe, that dealt with meant frightened into silence and sent somewhere. A payment, a new life somewhere else. He looked at Harper with something that might have been genuine anguish, or might have been the very good simulation of it that very practiced self-deceivers achieve. When the death certificate came, the cancer diagnosis, the funeral, I told myself that's what had happened, that it was real, that she'd died of natural causes. She's in the ground with her children, Harper said. Pierce said nothing. The DNA will confirm it within the week. Harper leaned forward slightly. I want the documentation of the financial scheme, the full record of where the money went, how it was structured, who else was involved. I want the names of every person in Cutter's Creek who knew something and stayed quiet. I want everything. And in exchange? In exchange, I will note your cooperation in my report. Harper held his gaze. But I want to be very clear about something, Dr. Pierce. There is no exchange that results in you not being charged. The cooperation affects the degree, not the fact. Pierce looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, a single slow movement. There's a storage unit in Grants Pass, he said. I'll give you the address. There's a box inside with everything. Bank records, correspondence, Walter's personal notes on the arrangement. I kept copies of everything because I always knew this day would come, and I wanted to be certain that if it did, Walter Briggs didn't take it all with him when he died. He paused. I am not a good man, Ranger Harper, but I am a careful one. Harper stood. I need you to remain in Port Orford while the Oregon State Police secure the storage unit. You will not leave the county. You will not contact anyone from Cutter's Creek or related to this case. I understand. Harper moved toward the door. One of the Oregon detectives stepped forward to stay with Pierce. At the threshold, Harper paused. Susan trusted you, he said. She came to you for help. She thought you were going to help her. Pierce didn't answer. Harper looked at him for a moment, at the well-ordered room and the Pacific Coast garden, and the pleasant life assembled around a man who had helped bury 5 people in a West Texas field, and then driven to Oregon and grown roses. And then he walked out into the gray coastal air and called Megan Carter. It was the money, he said. Briggs was embezzling from the town fund. Pierce was laundering it through his practice. Susan overheard something that scared them. On the other end of the line, Megan breathed. And the children? They saw Briggs crossing the yard that night. A long silence. When she spoke, her voice was very low. Lily used to call him Uncle Walter. He used to bring her candy. She liked him. Harper stood on the road above the ocean. "Megan, I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit down before I tell you." "What?" "There's a fifth set of remains." The sound she made on the other end of the line was not a word. He waited. "Susan," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "The DNA will confirm it, but yes, I believe so. The death certificate, the cancer, the funeral. It was constructed." "David identified her body," Megan said, and her voice had gone somewhere very far away. "He stood at a graveside and identified her body. He told me she looked peaceful." "I know." He knew. Not a question, either. Something else. "I don't know yet how much he knew. The journal doesn't go that far. But we're going to find out." Harper looked at the gray ocean. "I'm coming back to Texas tomorrow. I need you to be careful tonight, Megan. Don't stay at the place you've been staying. Go somewhere no one would expect." A pause. "You think they'd come after me?" "I think whoever put a photograph of a dead child on my kitchen table is trying to tell me something about the consequences of continuing. And you are closer to this case than almost anyone." Her breathing was steady. Controlled, this woman. Always controlled. "All right," she said. "I'll move tonight. I'll call you when I land tomorrow." He ended the call and stood there for another moment. The ocean moved below the headland with the indifference of very large things toward very small ones. Somewhere in a storage unit in Grants Pass, there was a box with 30 years of evidence in it. A dead man's careful insurance against a future that had arrived 12 years too late for him. And in a small cemetery in Cutter's Creek, Texas, there was a grave marked with Susan Cartwright's name, and the ground beneath it held something else entirely. Something they would have to account for. And the woman who had been buried there, under another woman's name, was Megan Carter's sister. And Megan had stood at that graveside too, and believed it, and grieved. And the grief had been real, even if everything else was built on lies. He got in the rental car. On the passenger seat, he'd left the folder with the children's school photographs. And the top one was James Soto, Megan's son, 8 years old, shoes by the side of the cot. A habit he'd had whose origins she'd never been able to explain. Harper started the engine and drove. The investigation became public on a Thursday in late September, 30 years and 2 months after 4 children and their mother had been placed in the ground on the Cartwright Ranch. The press conference was held on the steps of the Callahan County Courthouse in Baird, and Harper stood at the edge of the gathering and watched the district attorney lay out the facts in the careful, measured language of institutional justice. A financial crime, a cover-up, 5 murders, 2 primary perpetrators, 1 deceased and 1 in custody in Oregon, awaiting extradition. Multiple secondary figures, some deceased, some still in Cutter's Creek, who had known or suspected and had maintained their silence through a combination of fear, complicity, and the deep human instinct to preserve the version of reality in which they were not required to act. David Cartwright had been arrested 2 days prior. He had not contested the charge of obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. He had provided a full written statement in which every detail was precise and unsparing, the statement of a man who had been carrying weight for 30 years and had finally put it down, not because it was the right thing, but because it had become literally heavier than he could bear. His lawyer had tried to frame this as an act of courage. Harper had read the statement 3 times and felt something complicated and unresolved about that framing that he suspected would stay with him for a long time. Megan stood beside him at the edge of the courthouse steps. She'd come back from the place she'd moved to, a motel outside Abilene, 3 days ago, when Harper had personally driven her from one location to the other in the flat pre-dawn dark of the Texas plains. They'd talked the whole drive. Not about the case, for once. About what comes after. About whether a person can build something on the far side of a grief that has occupied 30 years of their life. About whether the truth, once known, fills the hole it was supposed to fill, or simply makes the shape of the hole more visible. He didn't have answers for that. He hadn't pretended to. She didn't reach for his hand during the press conference, and he didn't reach for hers, but they stood close enough that he could feel the steadiness of her beside him, and that was its own form of contact. The funerals were held 10 days later, private, family only, in the Cutters Creek Municipal Cemetery. It had taken some debate and considerable legal coordination to determine whether Susan Cartwright's existing grave marker should remain or be moved. In the end, a new section of the cemetery was designated. 5 headstones in a row, placed on a morning that was cool for the first time since spring. The sky high and pale blue, the kind of Texas sky that is possible in October, when the summer finally lets go. Maya, Eli, Lily, James, Susan. Megan placed flowers on each grave. She knew what flower each person would have wanted, and she had gotten all of them right. And she placed them without speaking, and stood in front of James's stone for a long time, with her hands by her sides. Harper stood back and watched. He believed in giving people space at graves. He'd learned that not from training, but from experience, from standing at a small headstone outside San Angelo 4 years ago, and needing the space himself. When she turned back, her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. "Is it enough?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for the right answer. "It's what we have," he said. "It's the most the truth can do. It can't undo. It can only make the record accurate." She nodded. They walked back toward the cemetery gate together, through the rows of other graves, the old flat markers of Cutters Creek's history, and the dry grass crackled under their feet, and the October wind moved through the juniper trees at the boundary of the cemetery. At the gate, she stopped. "Alan Pierce is going to survive this," she said. "He'll get a plea. He'll serve years, not decades. He's 71. He may die in custody, may not. But he'll be comfortable. He'll have books and food and clean water, and people required by law to ensure his well-being." She looked at the gate. James was afraid of the dark. He always left the bunkhouse lamp on. Harper had no response that was adequate to that. He didn't offer one. The drive back to Abilene took 40 minutes on the straight, flat highway, the kind of drive where the road unspools ahead of you and the horizon doesn't change. Megan sat in the passenger seat with her window cracked and the hot wind in her hair. "What happens to you now?" she asked. "The case closes. I write the final report. I go back to the next case." "There's always a next case." "Always." She looked out at the flatlands. "Do you ever stop seeing them? The children in the cases?" "No," he said, "but I stopped being afraid of seeing them." He kept his eyes on the road. "They're not haunting me. I'm remembering them. There's a difference." She was quiet for a long time after that. They were 20 miles from Abilene when she spoke again. "I want to show you something when we get back," she said. "Something I've been carrying in my bag for 30 years. I brought it with me from Odessa. I didn't know why at first." "What is it?" "A photograph. The four of them together. It was taken the morning before they disappeared. Maya found a disposable camera in the bunkhouse, and they took pictures of themselves all morning." She paused. "The camera was in Lily's bag. I took it home after. I had it developed 2 years later when I finally could. I've kept the photographs since." She looked at her hands in her lap. "In all the photographs they're laughing. Every single one." Harper kept driving. The highway bent slightly north, and the afternoon sun dropped behind his shoulder, and the road stretched ahead, clean and long, and the speedometer held at 62 miles per hour, and the engine ran smooth. He pulled into his driveway in Abilene at 4:30 in the afternoon. The front door was unlocked. He was certain, with the absolute precision of a man who has checked and double-checked every morning since the first time, that he had locked it. He put his hand on Megan's arm. She went still immediately, reading the situation from his face before he spoke. He drew his weapon. "Stay in the truck," he said. "Call 911. He moved to the door in a low approach, the dust of the driveway hot under his boots, and he pushed the door open with his foot and held to the frame and let the interior adjust to the late afternoon light before he moved through it. The living room was empty, kitchen empty. He moved down the hallway with his back to the wall. The bedroom was empty. The bathroom was empty. He cleared the last room, the small back room he used as an office, and it was empty too. But on the desk, placed precisely at the center, was a single item he had never seen before. A child's shoe, small, worn, the rubber sole dried and cracked. The kind of wear that comes from 30 years in the ground. James Soto's shoe, placed on his desk in his locked house while he was 40 miles away, burying 5 people in a cemetery, by someone who had a key to his home, or the means to obtain one, who had been in Cutter's Creek 30 years ago, or knew someone who had, who knew about James's shoe by the bunkhouse cot and had kept it, or received it, or found it. Someone who was not Alan Pierce, currently in Oregon under police supervision. Someone who was not Walter Briggs, dead since 2019. Someone who was still here, still in this county, this town, this everyday life. He stood in the middle of his office with the gun still in his hand and looked at the small, worn shoe on his desk. And outside, through the window, he could hear Megan on the phone with 911, her voice level and clear and giving the address. And somewhere in Abilene or in Cutter's Creek or in one of the flat, anonymous towns in between, someone was waiting to learn whether what they'd left behind had been enough to stop what was coming. It was not enough. Harper uncocked his weapon and holstered it and picked up his phone and called his district supervisor and said, "We're not done. There's at least one more." If this case has stayed with you the way it has stayed with us, hit subscribe and follow this investigation, because we are not finished. The identity of whoever walked into a Texas Rangers locked house and left that shoe is the question that keeps everyone on this team awake at night. And the answer, when it comes, is going to change everything you thought you understood about Cutter's Creek and the people who protected its secrets for 30 years. New episodes drop every week. Don't miss what comes next. And before you go, we want to hear from you. Who do you think left that shoe on Harper's desk? Someone still inside the Cutter's Creek power structure? A person connected to Briggs that the investigation hasn't surfaced yet? Or someone closer to this case than anyone has considered? Leave your theory in the comments. The best ones from last episode were more accurate than we expected, and this community has a way of seeing things that even experienced investigators miss. We read everything. Tell us what you think. Through the window, the October afternoon was gold and still, the sky enormous and indifferent, and the shoe sat on the desk like an accusation no one had signed. And somewhere in West Texas, the answer was waiting, in a life that looked completely ordinary, hiding in plain sight the way it had been hiding for 30 years, patient and certain and close.